All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone joining us from across the country and the world. I'm Michael Higgs here at Conscious Capitalism. We appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in community with us today. Today, we're joined by Jocelyn Mangan to explore diversifying the boardroom. As many of you know, Conscious Capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of capitalism and business. It is a movement of business leaders around the world working to change the practice and perception of capitalism to elevate humanity. And Conscious Capitalism is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement. Every week, we're offering virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how the philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Jocelyn will be in conversation for about 25, and then we'll transition to audience questions during the last 15 to 20 minutes of our session. Please be sure to type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any technical questions or issues, just send us an email at info@consciouscapitalism.org. And it is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jocelyn Mangan. Jocelyn founded Him for Her, a social impact venture aimed at accelerating diversity on corporate boards. She has over 2 decades of technology experience building iconic global mobile apps and market-leading software products at some of the world's best local consumer and marketplace companies, including CitySearch, Ticketmaster, OpenTable, and Snagajob. Jocelyn currently serves on the boards of Papa John's International, ChowNow, an online food ordering system and marketing platform, and is an advisor to Homebase, a platform to help local businesses manage hourly work. She's a part-time moderator for Netflix Leadership Program. Welcome, Jocelyn.
Hi there. Thank you for having me, Michael. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us.
So I'm going to get started. And as Michael said, I'm going to walk through a few things today. And then I'm really excited to get your questions to make this as interactive as possible to make sure you guys get what you want to out of this session. So as Michael mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of Him for Her. And, you know, I founded Him for Her because I saw an opportunity to accelerate the pace of diversity in the boardroom. You know, today, as we sit here, only 1 in 5 public company board directors is a woman. And then when we look at the private company space, we've done a study of the most highly funded venture-backed private companies, and about half of those boards are still all male. And the reason tends to be pretty simple. You know, people find their board members through personal networks, and those networks aren't necessarily diverse. And so we exist as an organization to close what we call the network gap. And we do it in a few ways. We host small executive roundtables where we bring people who can put people on boards as their CEOs, board members, investors, together with people who are ready to serve on boards, and we do moderated conversations. We also do education like what we're doing today. Today's session, you know, what I'm really hoping to do is demystify the boardroom. And with an audience like this, such incredible leaders who've dialed in for this time, I'm hoping to cover this topic in a way that serves you, whether you're interested in joining a board yourself, or if you're on the other side of things and you're leading a company looking for diverse board members, and kind of the importance of that, and also how you go about that. So that's the goal for today. And obviously, you know, I love working with an organization like this because you are all here because you believe that business has a purpose. And if you think about the boardroom and we kind of ground ourselves in why would we be talking about that, you know, people often ask me, what does it even mean to be board ready or to be on a board? And I like to tell the story of what I told my children when I started the company 3 years ago. And at the time they were 6 and 9 years old, and they asked me, you know, what's a board member? And I had to kind of distill it down into a definition that they could understand. So I said, it's the boss of the boss. And if you really think about it, you know, it is that ecosystem that sits above a CEO and is really there to provide the governance, the strategy oversight, the financial oversight, as a guide to the CEO and then on behalf of the shareholders. And so when we try and ground ourselves in what does board ready mean, the good news is it's a broad definition. So at Him for Her, we are ourselves a nonprofit, but we help put people on boards at for-profit companies. And to be honest, that ranges quite widely, whether it's a seed stage startup or if it's a Fortune 50 public company. And so when I say it's good news, I mean that definition of board ready is a broad spectrum. And what it really does mean, though, is you as a board member need to have amassed enough operational experience to guide a CEO. You're not there to operate the company, but you're really there more as a guide. And so if you think about guiding a seed stage company, that might be a first-time CEO, a small company, a small board where you're serving as the first independent. It also could be as complex as a large multi-billion-dollar public company, and you're serving on a board with 10 to 12 people. So that's the good news is it's a broad definition. And in today's world, I think it's really encouraging that people are looking beyond what might have been a traditional definition of a board member. So I think people often picture someone who's retired or someone who's been a CEO or CFO. All those things can still be true. But what we're finding in the ecosystem is a lot of people are looking for different types of gaps. So when I say ecosystem to describe a board, that really is accurate, because a board is made up of the sitting CEO and whatever skill sets she or he might have, as well as who are the existing board members and what are their skill sets. And if you put that together, then you marry that with what's the skill set that might be missing on this board as we look to build strategy for the next 3 to 5 years. And what we're seeing come back is every industry, lots of different operating definitions, whether it's a chief people officer, whether it's a digital marketer, someone who's seen scale, someone who's taken a company from a certain revenue number to another revenue number, or someone who's gone from private to public. So there's a wide definition of what it means to be board ready. So if you're on the side of wanting to serve on a board, we'll talk a little bit about how to frame your experience in a multidimensional way. And if you're on the side of looking for a board member, it's a great way to start to decide what skill set you might be needing. And so as we think about boards, there's a couple of different types of boards. There are nonprofit boards, there's private company boards, there's public boards, and increasingly we've seen the rise of SPACs who also have their own board structure. And I often get asked, is serving on a nonprofit board a good way to parlay yourself into for-profit board service? And I like to start there by saying, there's correlations for sure, in the sense that if you're on a nonprofit board, you're going to learn things like governance because you're operating as a board member for that nonprofit. But like anything you do, it really needs to resonate with you in terms of where you want to spend your time. Your time is your biggest asset. And so if you're choosing to go to a nonprofit, make sure you believe in the cause and you believe in the purpose the same way you would if you were joining a for-profit company. The only other thing to kind of consider with the nonprofit is sometimes there's a fiduciary responsibility that's different from a for-profit company, whereby you're either on deck to donate your own capital towards the nonprofit, or you are set to help raise money for that nonprofit. When it comes to private company boards, there's also a pretty wide range, and that is also because private companies can be early stage, mid stage, or late stage. But typically on the private company side, a heavy group of those board members are also investors. And so if you're stepping onto the board, you're going to be likely in the independent seat. And there might be 1 or 2 independents, and as the company grows, they'll add more and more independents. And then on the public company side, those are, the ones that are regulated by the SEC. They're publicly traded. There's criteria for those boards. They have a committee structure. So they have an audit committee by definition, a nominating and governance committee, and a compensation committee. So when you're serving on the public company boards, it's almost like you're wearing multiple hats, because typically you're part of a committee, which is a smaller group of the board, as well as the large board. So going back to the first question of does nonprofit correlate to for-profit, one of the key things that I also want to talk about besides the types of boards is how you find your board seats. And I mentioned this in the beginning, it's really at the heart of our company. And the truth is when people are looking for board members, it's up to them. And there's different ways that they might go about that. They might use an executive recruiter. There's a lot of great executive recruiters out there. They might use a service where they pay for access to a database to look for candidates. But what we found in our research is the vast majority of people are going through their word of mouth networks. And so as you think about, for those of you out there who are looking to get onto a board, I often say the way that I think about networking onto a board is very specific. And what I tell people out there is to write down the names of the CEOs the investors and the board members, active board members And what you want to do is proactively reach out to those people. Why those people? Those are the people that can put people on boards. So you want to proactively reach out to them, tell them you're interested in board service, remind them what it is you bring to a board, and then ask them to keep you top of mind. It's a very proactive way of networking. And then if you're on the side of looking for board members, you really will want to look outside your personal network, because that's where you're going to find a broader range of candidates, a widening of the aperture of the people that you consider. And certainly Him for Her is an organization that can help you there. I mentioned we're a nonprofit, but there's also other ways to make that effort to be intentional about being diverse in terms of selecting board members, but also intentional about using methods that aren't just within your normal reach. So that's a little bit about how to get on a board. The other thing I want to talk about is how to think about yourself as being board ready and describing yourself in terms of opportunities. And what I like to talk about here is that many people, when they're thinking about themselves, might think about their experience across maybe one dimension or two dimensions. And we really encourage people to think about their experience across multiple dimensions. And when I say multiple dimensions, and we can follow up with putting this in chat if it's helpful, but we think about looking across different categories of competencies. And this is both, if you're looking for a board member, or again, if you're yourself looking to describe what it is you might bring to a board. So we think about this as functional expertise, industry expertise, business model expertise, customer segment expertise, scaling expertise or growth trajectories that you may have seen, and finally ESG. And so when you're thinking about describing what it is you bring to a board, make sure you're thinking about your range of experience across these multiple dimensions of expertise. And if you struggle, a hack that I like to tell people that I learned from one of our discussions is ask one of your peers. So if you're struggling to remember what all the things you've done across those areas of expertise, ask someone who knows you well, and they'll be able to remind you what those things are. So moving on to one aspect of board services compensation that I think is worth touching on. And as we think about compensation, and I'm speaking specifically about the for-profit board members, private company boards are typically paid in equity only, and the equity ranges based on how far along that company is in its growth trajectory. Many private companies, once they hit kind of a mid-stage or larger private company, they will also start to pay their board members a cash, either annual salary. Some people do a per meeting fee, but I think with COVID and the way meetings have kind of changed, that's a little less common. And the equity is usually in line with how the company is growing, and it can get revisited as the company grows more and more. Public company compensation for board members is public, so you can actually go see what they pay their board members, and typically that is an annual fee as well as a committee fee. And some of the committees like audit will have more, as well as stock. And because it's public, it's public company stock. There are rules of for board members, not only how often they can sell, but also how much they need to hold on to of that stock at any given time. So, so that's compensation. I think one of the things that's interesting is, and there's a lot that's different about finding a board and sitting on a board than being an executive. And one of the things we think about is, with board compensation, oftentimes you're not negotiating it because it's set, which is different from interviewing for an executive role. That changes if maybe you're the first independent. And so we often get contacted by either the first independent candidate or sometimes even that CEO who's bringing on their first independent to ask, how do you set the bar for that compensation? So hopefully this is bringing up some good questions for you guys. The other thing I want to mention is kind of the process for finding that board seat. I mentioned, how you go about networking to your first board seat. If you're on the side of picking a board member, how you reach outside your networks to look for a broader set of candidates. But the process itself is also a little bit different typically from an executive role, in the sense that many times it's not as urgent. So you can imagine if you're an executive who's missing a key C-level position, CFO, CMO, those are urgent searches. They're requiring a lot of fast-paced interviewing. But if you're missing your independent director, it might stretch over a longer period of time. So if you're on the side of you're doing the search, I think it would be great for more people to communicate the timeline to the candidates. And if you're on the candidate side, also to think about asking, what is the timeline? Because we often hear from people who maybe had a good interview and they don't hear anything for 4 to 6 weeks and they get concerned, but that actually might be very expected given that timeline process. And we're here with a group who's rooted in conscious capitalism. And I think as you're interviewing board members and as you're thinking about joining a board, I think there's a lot of things you want to kind of inquire about, because if you are considering a board seat, it's a big commitment. I often tell people to think of that on a 10-year horizon, and it may not be 10 years of your life that you sit on that board, but it easily might be. And so as you're thinking about a board seat, I think there's a couple of key questions and key areas to focus on. One is really to spend time with the CEO. It's a big part of the role is to be working with the CEO. And so you want it to be someone who you believe in, someone who you enjoy working with, someone who you like to spend time with. That goes for the rest of the board as well. You're there to contribute. You're there to provide impact with your experience, but you're also going to learn. And so it's great to interview across the board and make sure these are people that broaden your network that you're going to learn from. Another key area to probe on during the interview process is transparency. So ideally, as a board member, you really want to have access to information at the company, people at the company, a free kind of flow of information, obviously in appropriate ways, in terms of, you're not running the company, so you're not going to be diving into too much detail, but you also want to make sure that the board does have that ability to get to know not just the CEO, but the rest of the executive team and other people in the company, because that just helps that board member be more successful in understanding the culture, the people. Another thing you'll want to consider is, are you interested in the industry? And that does not necessarily mean that you have to come from that industry. In fact, many times it's advantageous not to come from the industry, but you are going to be studying it, because as a board member, you really need to stay up with competition, emerging trends. And so it's important that you really are interested in that industry. And so another question that we often get, which is, how much time does it take to sit on a board? And I think it's a really interesting question, because the way we like to answer this is there's structured time and unstructured time. And structured time is predictable, right? So you can interview around that. You can say, hey, how many meetings do you have a year? How many in-person meetings? The in-person meetings are coming back slowly but surely. I think, the trend that I'm seeing is kind of Q2 and Q3 this year was largely remote. And I think boards have reconsidered how they move forward, if it's always going to be in person or not. And I think like many things in this this world, they're figuring it out and it's not set in stone, but it seems to be that it'll be a hybrid for the most part, where in-person will be a component when it's safe. But interviewing around the board meeting schedule is great. That's the structured time. What I mean by the unstructured time is, actually, I'd like to quote someone who was a panelist with us one time, and he was asked, how much time does it take to sit on a board? And his answer was, it's a breadcrumb every day. And the reason I thought that was so compelling is it's really true. There's a lot that comes up for a board outside the meeting where board members are working on behalf of the company. And that could be reading an industry article. That could be, referring a candidate for an open C-level role. The company could be going through M&A. They could be going through a crisis of some sort. And the board is required to be there. So as you think about, whichever side you're on, I think as a candidate, making sure that you ask about the structured time, but understand that there will be unstructured time. And then I think on the hiring side, really setting the expectation about what you're going to need. The board is there on behalf of you. And I'm speaking to the CEOs out there. And so, some of the private company boards want more time with their independents. I typically have a monthly call with my private company board CEOs, but on the public company side, it might be quarterly. And so really understanding what that is key. I have one more topic I'm going to cover, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So I want to make sure we cover everything that's on people's minds. But I think, we also often get asked, what is it like to serve on a board when you're operating? And how do you make sure that you're being a valuable board member? And I think this is where, all of the tenets of conscious capitalism come into play, which is you're there to see around corners, to listen, to ask thoughtful questions, but you're not there to run the company. And so when we think about making that transition from operator to board member, and many of us will be sitting in both seats at the same time, it is a switch. And it's one that I found more difficult than I expected, I think, because as a senior executive, you're just expected to take care of things, make decisions, do the work, hire the people. And as a board member, really spending more time listening than talking, spending more time asking questions and providing answers is a craft. And I think it's one that actually benefits all leaders, to be honest. And one of the hacks we talk about there is the practice of what questions and how questions versus why questions. And what people find in that reality is that it opens the dialogue more, and it causes less kind of defensiveness in the conversation. So that's a nice hack that I'll offer to the audience. And I think the other thing too is really thinking long-term about the company. There's a lot of things that might be top of mind in the quarter, but as a kind of conscious board member, you're really seeing that company 3 years from now and looking back and saying, what are the kind of questions I should be asking? What are the things we should be looking out for? And last but not least, spending the time. That's another quality that comes up, which is, not always just ticking the box of did I read the deck and go to the board meeting, but spending thoughtful time with teams within the company, as appropriate with the agreed upon with the CEO, supporting that CEO, not just, business strategy, but network. So that's one of the most valuable things a board member can do, is to open up your personal network in ways that help the company either find partners or new employees, et cetera. So I'm going to pause there, Michael, and invite you back on so that we have enough time for Q&A.
Absolutely.
Hopefully that was a good 101 for those in the audience.
That was fantastic, Jocelyn. Thank you so much. I can see by the participant account, the number of people that have joined us today, that this is a very hot topic and one that people are very interested in. I'll go ahead and start with a question. As a board director, how do you support companies to be more conscious?
That's a great question. the landscape that we're operating in now has kind of helped all of us be more conscious. I mean, we are over the last, 18 months, I think companies have come into the world of so many difficult topics that maybe hadn't been in companies. They've been there, but maybe not talked about. Maybe they'd been there with the boards, but maybe been not talked about. What I mean is specifically things like employee mental health, return to work has opened up a lot of conversations around conscious behavior, right? I mean, we've been staring into each other's living rooms and dining rooms, and that's really made us more vulnerable at work in terms of, this is my background and my daughter's downstairs and her school is closed today, and so it's made us have to kind of address more real topics, I think, in terms of employees being themselves. And it's been a really hard time for many people. We've also dealt with, racial injustice. We're facing climate change. And these things are happening. And so as a board director, how do you make sure they're coming into the boardroom? I think very practically, you are asking questions around them, right? So, I use the phrase ESG. I think probably most people on the call know what I mean, but if they don't, the E stands for environment, S is social, and G is governance. And boards are increasingly building committees around ESG, but even if they're not, that deep in the committee structure, boards should be asking questions. What is our plan for our climate strategy? How is inclusion working at our company? Not just diversity hiring, but what are we doing once we hire diverse candidates to make sure we're creating an inclusive environment? As it relates to governance, there's lots of things under governance. But cyber, I mean, there's a broad range that boards should be curious and asking questions about. And then, if they're not hearing answers of strategy, pushing on those things so that the company at large is becoming more conscious of the things that they need to be aware of.
Thank you. Next question is from Catherine, and she asks, it seems like boards want people that have worked with or for large companies rather than an entrepreneur or small business owner. How can you be seen as an asset as a founder or a small business owner? She mentions, I've worked in corporate in the past, and I do have multi-million dollar company experience, but that seems to carry no weight.
Yeah, so I think it's all about finding the right opportunity for you, Catherine. We often get people who are specifically looking for founders because they need that mentality in their company. So it's interesting. A lot of the little companies who want to be big are looking for people who've seen that big company. They've seen that scale because that's what they're aspiring to. But don't forget, there's a lot of big companies out there who need that entrepreneurial spirit. They need to disrupt themselves. They need transformation. And so having, I think the key for you is to think about those 6 dimensions of expertise and really playing it out, because, one way to label your experience is you've been a founder and you've done small business. But if you really look at each of those 6 and play out what you've done in each of them, that broadens your story. And I think there are boards out there who are looking for people with founder and small business experience. Yeah, thank you for putting that in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to jump to a question from Eric. And Eric says, I understand and support the importance of diversity and inclusion. However, are there other metrics besides gender, race, etc., that can serve as primary metrics to assess the degree of diversity? What metrics might you, Jocelyn, suggest to assess that board diversity?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I mean, really, if you take a giant step back, why are we even talking about diversity? We're talking about having the right conversation in the most important room in business, the boardroom, with different perspectives to avoid groupthink, which is a giant risk to any company, is to get a bunch of people in the room who always agree with one another, who all have the same lived experience and can only see one way of doing something, right? So that's actually what we're working to avoid. And so as you think about diversity, clearly Him for Her was set up to solve the gender diversity problem within boards. But, we think way beyond that, as do many of the healthy boards. They think about things like operating versus retired, right? So it starts with who do you have today? Who's your CEO today? Who's your existing board today? And you're trying to fill the gap. But that gap doesn't necessarily just need to be a gender gap. It needs to be a lived experience gap. Do you need someone from a specific industry? Do you need someone who's closer to a different generation, because your customer base is that generation and no one on your board understands that generation, for example? Do you need someone from a different country, a different culture? A different industry? I think I said industry already, but even within the industry, a different role. So is everybody on the board have an investment background? Are they all financial? So I think the healthiest boards are the ones who are thinking across multiple dimensions of diversity, and what they're looking for is the missing voice. Or voices. It's usually not one, it's two or three. And that's another way to think about it, which is, if you have 4 board members today and you're going to go to 7, and you look at your company strategy over the next 3 to 5 years, what voices are you missing in the conversation? And that's what you're trying to fill in. So hopefully that gives you an answer, because it's really looking at diversity across a multitude of dimensions and in context to what you're working from today.
Thank you. Next question is from Deeta, and she says, in your opinion and the experience that you've come to know of others, what is the toughest part in the process of getting on your first board? What is that hurdle or obstacle?
Yeah, it's really a messy ecosystem. People tend to find their board members in their personal networks, right? Which aren't typically that diverse. But equally, there's a lot of people who want to be on boards and they can't find the opportunities. There's no LinkedIn page that says, here's all the open board seats across the globe. What tends to happen actually is that the board seats themselves are held in personal networks, right? You have to know the CEO, and you have to know they're looking for a board member, or you have to know the venture firm or the private equity firm who's looking for the board member. And so that's why I think the most successful way is to network in the way that I said, which is to write down the CEOs, the board members, and the investors, because that's where the demand sits. And that's really the biggest challenge, is that the demand side doesn't always see the supply, and the supply doesn't always see the demand. And so that's really why we created the company, because we're like, there's got to be a way to create a little bit more efficiency here. And so if you're on the candidate side, which it sounds like you are, I would say if you use the methodology that I said, it's the quickest way to network into those opportunities. Now, I think there's another side of it, is make sure you're representing yourself holistically, which is the 6 dimensions of how you describe to those people what it is you're going to bring to a board.
Wonderful. Next question is from Mary. She comments that she's been approached by organizations that do a training or a certification program. What are your thoughts, and is this something that you would recommend?
And I guess I'm asking, Mary, I'm assuming that these are for getting on a board versus you're on a board and you're doing continued education for your board seat. I'm going to go with that.
And Mary says yes.
Okay. Well, so here's what I would say. I think there's a lot of organizations out there that quote unquote get you ready for a board. And I think they can be really helpful in terms of gaining IQ about what a board seat is. Your readiness, to me, is more based in your operating experience, right? So if you're good at your job and you're good at your discipline, that's the path to getting board ready and getting board exposure. So what I mean by that is, asking to go to, if you're in a smaller company, asking to go to your own board meeting, even if it's just to observe or to present. I was invited into the boardroom at 28, changed my life. So how can you get access to your own board so that that room is closer to you? And if you're a large company, that's harder. That's okay. You can still ask, for kind of a debrief of what happened at the board meeting. And again, if it's an area that you're working on, you also might be able to go in and present or observe, regardless of your seniority, depending on your leadership. In terms of the courses specifically, I think they're good if you want to go learn IQ about the boardroom. So you want to understand what a public company board member does. But I think in terms of readiness, focusing more on your operating experience, your board exposure, and your own network is key.
Thank you. Next question is from Haley. And you touched on this in your presentation, Jocelyn, but she's wondering if you could speak a little bit more about SPAC boards. Is there an increased risk or opportunities on these boards, especially for conscious capitalists?
Yeah, so I actually didn't go into a whole lot about SPACs, so apologies for that. They are, a mechanism that's been around for a while, but become increasingly popular, and I think are kind of gaining and losing favor, it seems like, by the month. But here's what I would say. Everything you do is kind of rooted in the people. So the SPAC is just the vehicle. It's a vehicle to take a company public. And so, just like any group you'd go interview with, whether it's a SPAC group or an investor group, you want to believe in the people that you're going to be sitting on the board with. I think one of the things about the SPAC is it can be a quick process in terms of you're on the board of the SPAC, and there's, sometimes clarity that you're going to continue to sit on the board once they find the company that they're going to take public. And so, for a lot of people, that's a great way to get on a public company board. I think one other thing I would say is that, public companies are only 1% of our companies. So, so saying I only want to be on public company boards really takes a lot of opportunity off the table, just from a sheer numbers perspective. They're also very different jobs. I sit on one of each. I find them both incredibly valuable, but to be fair, my public board, I'm one of 10. And then on my private boards, I was, the first independent on one and one of two independents on the other. I'm also on the board of WAG. And so, do I have impact on all? I hope so. But the truth is I'm spending a lot more time with my unique experience with the private boards. Because they're earlier stage and they need the operating kind of impact maybe in different ways. But going back to the SPAC board, what I would encourage you to do is, it is a great opportunity if you do want to sit on a public company board, because by definition, those companies will go public. Is there risk? There's always risk, but trusting that you believe in the people who are part of that vehicle, who are going to go make that decision, that's key. Because that's who you're kind of like going to live with the results from that initial conversation. But I would give you the same advice if you were interviewing with a private equity firm to go sit on one of their company boards and they were going to be on the board with you. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. Next question is from Haidito, and he says, I'm of Asian origin with a board certification credential. I'm looking for a board opportunity of racial diversity, but I often find that the board recruiter is not so much interested in diversity. What should I do? It's a big challenge.
Well, what I would say is diversity and what the company needs should be one and the same, meaning all boards should have diversity to be successful. And they also have specific competencies they're looking to fill. So I think, stating what you identify as is part of who you are, along with the 6 dimensions of expertise that you're bringing. So making sure that you're presenting yourself and your experience across these 6 dimensions, as well as your lived experience and how that represents diversity for you and for that board is important. But ultimately, I think boards are looking to fill the gaps of competencies that they're missing. So making sure that, when you're talking to the recruiters, they're stating to you, what are the competencies the board's looking to fill? And you're equally stating to them, what are the competencies that you bring to that board, so that you're making sure the right opportunities are coming your way.
Thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who asked, I'm constantly approached by firms like Advisory Cloud who convey they can connect me with board opportunities. Is this a path to getting on a board, despite potential, it sounds like that they charge for these services? I
think your time and money is valuable. So I think you have to be careful where you're spending both. What we found in our research is the vast majority of people on the demand side look in their personal networks. So if you have a limited amount of time, I would focus on networking in your personal network before moving on to anything else, to be honest. But if you're taking a kind of a portfolio approach to your board seats, I think finding ways to try out different services to see what comes back is gonna give you the evidence that you need. Are you, if you're writing a check to someone, are the opportunities that are interesting to you coming your way? But I do still find we're supportive of all of the groups out there, but I do find that the vast majority of people on the demand side are looking at their personal networks.
Thank you. Question from an anonymous attendee again. How important is getting board certified, especially for your first board position?
As I think this is similar to the question before. Board certified is for you to learn about the board process, for you to learn about the board, but it's not necessarily that someone's going to be looking for on the demand side. I mean, we've helped over 600 companies with board searches, and that's not something that they've asked about. So I think, do it for yourself if that's going to be beneficial to you to learn more about the space of the boardroom. And I think largely from an IQ standpoint, but if you're talking about credentialing to get onto a board, again, most of the demand coming to us, they're looking for operating experience and, across these 6 dimensions. So I think even more important is making sure you're doing the internal work to understand what those are for you and that you're representing yourself holistically, right? That's the other thing I just want to stress is I think as executives, and I'm assuming many of you on the call are executives, we are used to representing ourselves in terms of what we've done, what we've accomplished. Michael introduced me. I worked at Open Table. I did this. But what the person on the hiring side for the board is, what are you going to bring to us? How are you going to translate what you've done in your operating experience to benefit, our board and our future as a company? And I think that's the framing that you want to be spending your time on. And so that's less about your certification. That's more about your story, and really translating that story to the right people. Those 3 groups of people that are most often putting people on boards: investors, CEOs, and active board members.
Wonderful. And to close, I want to ask one final question, Jocelyn. We have 2 minutes, and I do want to be respectful of your time. What do you wish you'd known as both someone who's been a board member and been governed by a board on how board directors can drive support and clarity for executives and organizations?
Oh my gosh, there's so much I wish I would have known. I wish I would have taken more advantage of as an operator of my board as a strategic asset. And not just seeing them as oversight, but really as a strategic asset to help me better. I think I'm doing a better job of that now as CEO of this company. The other thing I wish I would have known as a new board member is that my voice is just as powerful as everybody else in the room. And I wish I would have spoken up with my questions sooner. So hopefully that helps.
Wonderful. Well, again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you could please take 30 seconds to fill out the survey that is in the chat box, that helps us with some of our future programming. If you're new to Conscious Capitalism, you can visit consciouscapitalism.org for more information about our movement and organization. And we hope to see you all again here next week for Brandon Hatton's book launch. It's actually this Wednesday, so 2 days from now. If you'd like to join us for that virtual gathering as well. Jocelyn, thank you so much for a compelling and deeply informative conversation for our community.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks everyone for spending the time today.
Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too.